Welcome to Make Me Data Literate, the podcast that makes data intelligible from the Australian Data Science Education Institute. We're on a mission to make the whole world data literate. I'm your host, Dr. Linda McIver, and every week I'll interview someone with a wild and wonderful relationship to data. Let's see what we can find out.
Hello, and welcome to our next episode of Make Me Data Literate. I'm super excited to have Juliette O'Brien, the founder and maintainer of Covid19data.com.au, which is one of the places that I have been going to for my COVID data pretty much since the beginning. So, welcome, Juliette.
Hi, Linda. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited. Tell me, can you give us a kind of background? What do you do? How did you get into doing COVID-19 data, all that stuff?
Yeah, well, look, I fell into it. I've had what is fashionably called a portfolio career sort of thing, using inverted commas there. I studied journalism originally and then studied law, worked as a lawyer for about 60 seconds, and then just went back into media. And I was writing a book at the time. And look, I've always really done digital production and digital journalism. And so, the online desk has always sort of been the ugly duckling of the newsroom throughout the time that I've been there, but it's been through this whole transition period. So it's about 15 years. And so, as a digital, there's multimedia journalism and so on, but as in terms of digital production, a lot of that is working in sort of a news environment and wrangling stuff to get it online. So you'll work as a desk editor or work with journalists and so on. And then you're taking copy, assets, images, video, whatever, and you're working in different content management systems. And, you're just kind of trying to get it online in some way. And that's really how I ended up in the data side of things, where I was working on the breaking news desk of the Herald, and we wanted a chart to put into a story about COVID. And at that point in time, the cases across Australia were in the low 40s. So not only did the chart not exist, but the actual data didn't exist, like in terms of a time series. It was just Federal Department of Health. Maybe even at that stage, they didn't even have a page. But even if they did, it was sort of a snapshot. So you lost the history. And so it was sort of realizing that that didn't exist, and just with this digital production backgrounds, have it's results focused. It's like just get there in whatever way you can. So I just kind of pulled together this data set to try to track the cases, and always acknowledging if we exploded within the next 2 weeks in exponential growth, then probably wouldn't have been able to maintain it. But the way the cases tracked, I was able to maintain it manually. So that's really what happened. It was this transition from digital journalist to data journalist in that way. And, a couple of weeks later, I was on the drum, and Ellen Fanning was saying data journalist, Juliette O'Brien. And I was like, Ellen, I'm not a data journalist. And she was like, what are you? And I was like, I don't know anymore. But now, like 2 years later, just doing nonstop data 7 days a week, I'm very comfortable with that title.
That's awesome. Do you do other data other than COVID now, or is it still all just COVID all day, every day?
No, I definitely do other types of data. And like I try to keep it topical. And to be honest, I just do little Twitter threads. Um, so, it might be sort of female representation in parliament, that sort of thing. And now I'm teaching data journalism at UTS. And so that's really interesting, moving into lots of different types of data with all of the different ideas from students and so on. And something that I haven't published on yet, but am working on the issues around uh, catastrophes and climate change and flooding, and even in terms of that, this I'm working on this thing at the moment, with this one in 100 years concept. And why we say that, what that means in terms of probability and whether or not we need to change our language. So COVID has been my gateway drug into lots of other different types of data, as it has been for a lot of people, actually.
I was just thinking that. I think that's not an uncommon story. I love that you have a degree in journalism and one in law. Where is the data training? Where did that come from on the job?
Um, I am autodidactic in this, in like all of my data knowledge, 100%. But I mean, I was one of those, kind of teenage girls who fell off the STEM train.
Mhm.
So I was like, I remember coming top of maths in primary school, like in a certain year, and the teacher being like, she even beat the boys.
Oh God. Oh, even. Wow, it's a miracle.
Isn't that classic?
Oh.
But then in high school, it just became a little bit hard, and a bit too hard for me. And I was like, I prefer English and drama and all of that sort of thing. So, yeah, like I definitely regret that, not staying with some sort of STEM subject. And for sure, oh, look, law's coming in handy at the moment, especially like with sort of getting a couple of projects up and running and sorting out corporate governance and that sort of thing. But
Yes, I could have used you a couple of years ago, actually. I was
really?
setting up Etsy. Yeah. Oh, it was a minefield.
Oh,
No
there you
training at all.
go. To set up Etsy.
Yeah, so Etsy, the Australian Data Science Education Institute, which is the data science education charity that I run, was, it didn't exist. And at the start of 2018, I set it up, and I was just wading through the weeds in terms of all of the paperwork, and making it a charity and all that stuff was quite a learning curve for a computer scientist.
Oh my God. I'm going to pick your brains after this podcast about your experiences. Wading through the weeds is the way to say it.
Mm.
Oh man, it is absolutely diabolical, isn't it? Law.
Yeah.
So I've always kind of been like, well, that was 4 years and 35 grand wasted, but and it would have, I would sort of recommend in terms of analytical thinking and so on, the engineering and software development and so on can give you just as much analytical thinking as law. So yeah, if I had to do it again, I would do a more technical subject for sure. Yeah.
What do you think? You said that you dropped out of STEM because it was hard. Was that it? Like, was it just because you felt it was hard? Do you feel like there were other pressures, or was it interesting but hard? Or
Um, it's a good question. I mean, it's funny because my dad was a doctor, a surgeon, but even the science, I wasn't particularly drawn to science at all, and there was never any pressure in the family to go down that path. It was stick with do what you're good at and what you enjoy. It was the maths one that was hard, and yeah, it wasn't. It look, I don't want to detract from the wonderful teachers. I mean, but I didn't enjoy it. It was totally boring, and but I did fall into this thing of. I just remember sitting there with this really fun chick, Elisa, and we would just, I guess we kind of talked ourselves out of it. I can't do this. Oh, this is too hard, blah, blah, blah. Then we'd like just start talking and giggling and stuff like that. Oh my God, I hope my mum doesn't listen to this podcast. But
It-
um,
I think that's telling, though, that there was what reason was there to stay? It was boring and it was hard. And if it was interesting but hard, you'd have stuck with it, because clearly a challenge isn't particularly off-putting to you based on what you've done in the last 2 years in particular. It's
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, yeah. I think honestly think it's like the teenager um, got a little bit too, not too cool, but just um, I don't know. I can't really articulate it, but yeah, I think the other thing as well was at that time with the HSC, you could drop down to 10 units and you didn't have to have maths.
Mhm.
So it was this idea of playing to your strengths. So Yeah, dropped maths and stuck with the others.
Well, that's why I do what I do, really, to make maths more interesting and relevant, and the rest of the STEM fields. Um, that's a great intro. We diverged quite a long way from the questions, which is not a big surprise based on our first chat. What do you wish, like, from everything you've done the last 2 years and the way people have responded to COVID-19 data.com.au and all of the all of your experiences, what is there that you wish everyone knew about data?
Mm. Um, okay, well, the first thing is, and this sort of relates to, what we were just talking about. The big thing that I've done with COVID-19 data is I've been counting, right?
Yep.
Like, I'm not doing complicated modeling or anything like that. And actually, sometimes journalists have called me and they've said, "Oh, I want to talk about your modeling." And I'm like, it's not modeling, right? It's counting. And then maybe there's some maths to extrapolate out what I call the if nothing changes projection, just to show people what something actually means. Um, but I suppose that's the first big thing that I've learned, and that I guess I would love a lot of people to understand, especially journalists, is the power of counting is huge, because we spend a lot of time talking about trying to answer what's going to happen. And for me, answering the question, what is happening, is beyond a full time job, right? And that is actually the case in so many fields. Like this issue of what is happening, let's just try to answer that and measure it and get that right. And the evidence with COVID is that even that is incredibly difficult. Um, and so I suppose the big thing is, let's take testing as an example, right? So at the moment, we have this situation where Australia has some of the biggest case numbers in the world, right? And you can just take that at face value, but at least now we're all a little bit more data literate to understand that case numbers are a product of testing. And so if you're not testing, you don't have any cases.
Well, that was Donald Trump's idea at the start, wasn't it? If we don't test, we won't have any COVID. That's fine.
That was actually in my head as I was saying that. I was like, do I sound like Trump? But so what, I think like we always need to go the next step. So, okay, we understand, we compare, you know, case numbers between countries. But in order to inform that, we actually need to then compare testing rates between countries. And we do that a little in terms of understanding the positivity rate and so on. But I suppose that's the big thing that we want people to be able to hold in their heads past COVID, is when a number is quoted to us, to just be able to think about that critically. However, that is sort of dangerous as well, because this critical thinking can then go pretty quickly into conspiracy theory territory, can't it? So it's a bit of a tightrope.
It's a challenge. So I call it rational skepticism, where you have to be skeptical, but you have to be skeptical on the basis of data and evidence rather than on the basis of what some guy said on YouTube. And I love that idea, like the testing rates and the case numbers and stuff fascinate me, especially now, because we don't actually know the testing rate, because people are doing rats and we're not reporting negative rats, which is fine, but it means we don't know what the testing rate is. We have no idea. And I talk a lot in my workshops about proxy data, because almost every data set that we have is not actually the data set we want. It's just the data set that we have access to. So we want to know how many people have COVID right now. We don't know that. All we know is how many people have tested positive, which we hope is related to how many people have it, but it may be wildly off. We just don't
Yeah.
know.
And then the thing with that, I totally agree. And, this is something that I'm talking about with my students at the moment, where if you have imperfect data, that needs to not stop us from covering the topic, because you're going to have that a lot of the time. And also, then it gives the sort of gatekeepers of the data total control over the narrative and what we're even talking about. So we have to find ways, for instance, if we only have data to 2019, for instance, and there's evidence, and then you are filling in the gaps with, can you do a survey of particular institutions? Can you get expert kind of quotes or anecdotes or something to say, and this is what we think might have happened in the interim? Like, we have to find ways to cover the story in the context of imperfect data, and try to address that in a succinct and clear way for the audience and fill them in on the deficiencies of it.
Which is a monstrous challenge for a
Yeah.
journalist who's trying to reach everybody, not scientists and not mathematicians and not even just policymakers, but trying to make it intelligible to the entire population is massive. I did media training years ago, and we were told that if we wanted to pitch it to the general population, we should be aiming at an education age of about 12, which was
Mm.
horrifying at the time. But when you look at some of the commentary around it, I'm not sure that it's that wrong.
Oh my gosh, that is so interesting that you were told that in media training, because I have heard that one of the major newspapers in Australia does pitch at about that reading age, and they have a very big readership. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, you know what? This is but it's such an important thing, like simplicity of language, and of ideas. People think that they sound smarter by using bigger words and all of that sort of thing, but like that's one thing that I've always tried to do, and also economy of space is a big thing in digital media and also print,
Yeah.
and all kinds of communication, really. So it's about how can you convey an idea in the simplest, clearest language possible, and that requires clear thinking, and that requires you to understand the issue. So that's why I kind of say writing is not just writing. Writing is thinking. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's, it sounds to me as though the two kind of key attributes of a data journalist that you've described are, one, ability to count, and two, ability to communicate. What else would you say belongs in there?
Oh, totally. I mean, the communication thing is the big piece. So I think there's counting. Yep, for sure. There's communicating. There's the other thing is there's the collating, and I think that's been a big part of it as well. Is that I don't really have any particularly um, you know, special sources, right, of information. Like, there's no deep throat, right, sending me secret data, really. It's like about
I bet you wish there
scrounging.
was some days. It
That
would
would be,
help.
yeah, that would be awesome. It's about dealing with PDFs, and sporadic updates and changing formats, and I don't think a lot of it, like, ask Ken Sang, who's been scraping the federal vaccination PDFs, and he
Oh
tweets every time
man.
they change the format, and he has that little upside down smiling emoji. He's like, they changed the format again. And I think, there's a data department, and then there's a sort of health department, and then there's a media department, and then there's prime minister and cabinet, and they're kind of doing different things, and some of them have data as a priority, and some of them have messaging as a priority. So
Yeah.
um, I suppose that has been a big part of it, and that's sort of what a data journalist has to grapple with as well. It's just sort of hunting for data and wrangling it and being willing to put in the grunt work. And look, that's another thing that I've said. Like, I really think I ended up in this position partly because I was fairly non-technical. And so technical people, it's just not worth your time to do the stuff that I've been doing, right? So I'm happy to do it so that the people whose time is more valuable can do better things with it. I'm happy to play that role.
Tell us a bit about the process that you had to go through just to get hold of that data, because when I attended your talk a couple of weeks ago, I knew to some extent how bad it was because I'd been looking myself, but I didn't. I was a bit gobsmacked.
Really?
Yeah, it was horrifying. Tell us the story.
Um, yeah, it's interesting because you can imagine, people in the Department of Health saying, well, we've got a page and we update the page every day. So the data's there. But first of all, it was an evolution, right? And so the public have been ahead of the government and the bureaucrats pretty much every step of the way. And that's why when COVID-19 data went viral, the website over the weekend, that was basically the first weekend of March when Scott Morrison was going to go to the football and see the Sharks. Borders were open, and the public were kind of leading the way in terms of questioning the strategy and everything, and then that filtered to the states, which then filtered to the Commonwealth, right?
Mhm.
So that is when I pulled it together. Um, Back then, it was totally manual because we've got the added, not an issue, but the added layer of being a federation of states and territories, where the states and territories have power for in the division of powers, they take responsibility for health. So this immediately means it's like 8 small countries, right? All reporting in different ways. Um, and so back then, and for a good few months, I'd say, definitely through the first wave, um, it was I recorded it manually based on press conferences, and that's what the other data trackers were doing too. And that's when we formed like a little Twitter message group behind the scenes, and it was Jess who runs the big COVID Australia Twitter account, and Anthony McCarley, who runs COVID Live. And also at that time, we were communicating a lot with the team at the ABC, and I think Nick Evershed from The Guardian, and everyone working together to track the case numbers. And yeah, okay, you could say, well, you could wait till 11 o'clock at night because they did usually get updated at that time. But then there were things like, for instance, Tasmania, their reporting was out by a day, and it seemed like they reported very late, but actually they were ahead by a day. So they would wait all day and then report the numbers at night from that day.
Oh,
But
wow.
actually, from a data tracking perspective, it just meant that we would have the rest of the states, and then we'd be waiting around for Tasmania at like 7 o'clock at night. So yeah, sorry, what was the question?
I don't even remember. It's just so fascinating. Like, we think of data often as kind of, solid and straightforward, and the number of deaths is the number of deaths and things like that.
Mm,
And that I'm sure that the general public would assume that you just went to some kind of central site and pulled the data off every day. But
mm.
you were literally sitting watching press conferences and writing down the numbers.
Yes, exactly. So that was at the very start. Yeah, exactly. And there was with COVID, there was that sort of urgency. But to be honest, like that's something that I would love us to see in more data going forward is timely data. Not like data from 2017 being released. So yeah, like I think this timeliness and urgency of the data was a big thing, and the public demand for that was really huge. Then, bit by bit, each state and territory started updating a dashboard, but the dashboard would often be updated hours after a press conference.
Yeah, I noticed that. I was sitting there frantically hitting refresh the whole time.
Exactly.
Going, where is it? Come on, I know it's out there. Give me the data.
Exactly. And then they developed infographics and tweets and things like that. And so now Anthony at COVID Live has built scrapes all over the place, right? So as soon as a dashboard is updated,
Yep.
And he's super generous with alerts and everything. I receive those alerts. So now we get notifications. But honestly, like, we're two years in, and they were changing all the time. I mean, one thing that you were just saying with people understanding that the numbers, are not pure. This is actually a really interesting point, and the editor of the data editor of the Guardian US, called Mona Chalabi, who's an amazing data journalist.
She's fabulous. I use her videos in my workshops all the time. She's
Really?
wonderful.
Oh my God, she's a queen, hey. But she says, what, first of all, she's incredibly talented, so she does those awesome hand illustrations.
Yeah, they're brilliant.
But she talks about how she prefers them because it shows that a human being made this. This is not some higher divine computer god power, determining these numbers. These are human beings, and she thinks the hand illustrations convey that better. And so something that just happened to me today, right, is a couple of people have emailed me because on COVID-19 data right now, the vaccination rate for Tasmania has just gone over 100%, right? Like it did with ACT a while ago. And the problem there is not with the numerator, the vaccinations. The problem is with the denominator, the population. And this was actually something that Nigel Gladstone, data journalist at the Herald, said to me when I was at the Herald and just moving into this COVID thing, is like, you have to check, recheck, and recheck everything. And in data, just about everything is contentious. And you try asking people, getting some people to agree on the number of people there are in Australia right now, right?
Yep.
And this is the issue. How many people are in Tasmania? What is the denominator there? And why are we exceeding 100%? So a lot of the population data that we're relying on, and we follow the federal government on this, is they're using ABS population data. I think it's a 2020 file.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's just a different number of people who are in the country.
Yep. And it again, that's one of those things where you're like, so what's the population of Australia? And people don't expect to have "it depends" as the answer to that, but it does. With almost any data set, it depends. And wrapping our heads around that idea that no data set is perfect and no number is, I weigh myself because I'm trying to lose weight, and standing on the scales, I can get a different result, like within 60 seconds. I step on, I get a result, I step off, I step on again, a totally different result. And that's to do with the scales, but we don't understand, I think, how complicated it is to actually understand data and to wrap our heads around what any particular number even means. On that subject, tell me about the death rate. We were talking before about the COVID death rate being complicated. Tell me that story.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first time, the major thing that I saw, first of all, was actually the hospitalization rate before the death rate, because the death rate is, a big question at the moment. But in terms of the hospitalization rate, a perfect example of the arbitrariness of some of the COVID data, which is how many active cases are there.
Yep.
And this became a real issue during the Delta wave in winter 2021 because, the hospitalization rate had been high. Like in Victoria's second wave, it was essentially 1 in 10, a 10% hospitalization rate. And then, so we were looking for the hospitalization rate in the big Delta wave in New South Wales to try to understand that. And there were two issues. The first was that people were using the number of active cases as reported by New South Wales Health as the denominator, right?
Yep.
So the first question is, well, is that really the number of active cases that are actually out there? And then the second issue was that, you would be all over this, but there's this lag, right? So, and that really matters when you have thousands and thousands and thousands of cases. So if you've had 100,000 cases in the last sort of 5 days, those people literally have not had a chance yet really to fall sick enough to go to hospital, right? So what we had for a little while were people citing an artificially low hospitalization rate as evidence that the vaccines were working. And then when I wanted to just question that and say that is an artificially low rate, then people are like, are you saying vaccines don't work? Right.
Oh, no.
And it's this highly charged atmosphere where we're all thrown into this binary. But all I was saying was that's an artificially low rate. And, we need to find a different way to calculate it. Now, when New South Wales Health started releasing the hospitalisation rate in their excellent surveillance reports, and, in terms of Australia-wide, New South Wales Health and their surveillance reports are like head and shoulders above every single other state and territory. But they were delayed sometimes by up to 2 weeks. And what they ended up doing was instead of having this moving hospitalization rate, it was all people in hospital over all cases since the outbreak began, which seems to be the best way to calculate it.
Yeah.
And at that point in time, that was showing a hospitalization rate during the beginning of that Delta outbreak of 14%, right? So
whoa.
High, exactly. And look, we were looking for it to drop because we were looking for the effect of vaccines to kick in. But all it was like, it was sort of confirmation bias for people at the time where they were looking for the hospitalization rate to drop, therefore they found it in an artificial way. And it had not arrived yet. Thank God it did arrive. And so in terms of the death rates now, it's funny because the PM said he said in January, I think, so Omicron was absolutely exploding. Testing had fallen apart, right? Totally fallen apart. How many cases did we have? No one knew. That's when, of course, cases aren't important anyway, the PM said, right? Because he said something like, we don't track cases just for the sake of tracking cases, so like, positioning himself as I'm about, what's real, what's the real impact, what's actually going to help people, not this sort of academic work of data tracking. But then Sharon Lewin from the Doherty Institute, she did say knowing the cases is important because that is how we understand the relationship between disease severity and the overall wellness and so on. So we need to understand total cases, hospitalizations and deaths to understand this whole issue. But now we really don't understand what it is because we don't understand how many cases there are.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to know how virulent a disease is, so how likely it is to make you very, very sick or even kill you, you can't know that unless you know how many people have had it and therefore, and how many people have died. And and trying to track that is actually really difficult. I remember at the start of the pandemic, and when all we started to bandy numbers around about how virulent it was, how likely it was to kill you, and I went looking for other diseases because everyone's like, oh, it's just the flu or it's just measles or whatever. So I was like, okay, so what is the morbidity rate of the measles? And again, it was one of those things where, well, it's complicated. In what population? In what age group? In what, under what conditions? Do they have access to healthcare or not? And these it never occurred to me before COVID that this was a thing, that there was, that the answer to how dangerous is this disease is complicated, and you can't have one number that's, like 1 in 10 people will die. Well, no, it's, the percentages are different for different age groups. The percentages are different in different countries. The percentages are different for different outbreaks and different strains. And it's this complexity and kind of confusing nature of the data that I think is really difficult for people to wrap their heads around.
Yeah. And I have tried really hard to stay in my lane as well. So everything that you just said, coming from from expert knowledge, right? I think part of the problem has been lay people, like it's not so much an armchair epidemiology thing, but it's that we've been catching up, right, to wrap our heads around issues. So it's possible that even talking about hospitalization rate or death rate as an overall average is actually not helpful, right? And maybe it should be standardized for at least age, right? All the time,
Yeah.
just and because, there is evidence now that, yeah, like a 3-time vaccinated person in a certain group will always fare worse than an unvaccinated person in another group, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so right from the start, and actually when I found myself on the crest of this wave, and I didn't really intend to be there, and I certainly didn't intend to position myself as an expert, and I pushed away a lot of commentary at the start, because I really saw my role as, I will count, okay? I can do that. And I will count so that the real experts can then take it and communicate it.
Yeah.
But what happens? So I did find myself, like, honestly, a couple of times, like I would be on a radio interview sort of thing, and I just want to talk about, I would try to explain, don't ask me why, okay? Like, I think that's a pretty good line to draw. I can tell you what's happening, I can't tell you why. But occasionally then they'd be like, and now we've got some calls in, and then, like, I'll find myself like, oh my God, get me off this call right now, please. So I think that has been a bit of an issue. That's a line that I've tried to walk. But the problem is that um, the loudest voices often get propped up, and
Yeah.
if there isn't a voice, then the vacuum gets filled by the people who are kind of savvy and so on. So yeah.
And people want certainty. People are desperate for certainty. We've had so long now of uncertainty, of not knowing whether we're going to be in lockdown tomorrow, of not knowing whether we're going to get sick, of not knowing what the risk is, that when a voice that sounds certain comes along, it's very tempting to cling to that. And then to be a responsible data journalist, you have to go, well, we don't know. And that's not, people don't want to hear that.
No.
So they're not going to cling to that one. Somebody tell me something that I can cling to.
Yeah, that's right.
Have you ever seen data deliberately misused, do you think?
Yes. So I'm thinking of 2 examples. The first is, the journalist himself was very nice, but I mean, I did a lot of comparison charts, and I found them useful, because the question is always, are we 3 weeks behind Italy? Are we 3 weeks behind Victoria? This sort of thing. So I would put together a chart, and literally, I remember one, and I thought it showed. I thought it is self-evident. It shows that things are quite good, right? I think it
Mhm.
might have been the Avalon outbreak on the northern beaches of Sydney, where the issue there was you had this really steep incline at the start as they kind of found all of the cases, and then it really, it flattened out quite quickly.
Yeah.
Um, but I remember the Daily Mail used the chart, and
Oof.
the problem I think for some journalists at the Daily Mail is my understanding, right, from people who have worked there, is that you were given the headline, right,
Oh no.
and it's like write a story to this headline, and so yeah, I kind of my toenails sort of curled when I read the story because it was like data, an analysis, by data, whatever, Juliette O'Brien shows that, we're sort of catastrophic sort of thing. And I had thought that it showed the opposite.
Oh,
So that was one. And look, the other one and I'm really not in a position to publish anything on this at the moment, but I can just, muse to you about it, is this question of lockdowns and this idea, well, that Melbourne is the most locked down city in the world. Um, and I'm not, I don't discount it at all. But fact checking that is very hard. And
yes.
I remember the first time that I heard that, I was like, oh, that's that's incredible, right? If that's true. Um, and I tried to fact check it. Now it's even harder. Like now I want to really go back and find the source of it, because now if you Google that, you get tens of thousands of entries. But back then it was a fairly new idea. And
Hmm.
so from my research back then, I tracked it back. The first mention of it was in a Murdoch publication, right? And it
Yep.
referred to data, and it said the data is incomplete, or not incomplete, like the data is complicated or something like that, but based on this, Melbourne will be the most locked down city in the world on this day because it will surpass Buenos Aires, right?
Uh-huh.
That was the thing that was said again and again. So, when it says the data, you hope there's going to be a little hyperlink there, right? And
Yes.
it's going to go through
Yes.
to the actual data. Well, that didn't exist. So I
Uh-huh.
was like, okay, what data are they talking about? So the best I could find was Oxford has attempted to, taxonomize,
Oh, I saw that.
and it's, God bless them. Like, I mean, I don't know who is wrapping their heads around all of that, but the variety of restrictions in every single jurisdiction
Yeah.
around the world, and taxonomizing that into 5 tiers, I think it is, maybe six. So if you just look at that data set, and I have not done this for a few months, but when I did it at the time, part of the problem there is it's national, right?
Yeah.
And Australia was about 50th on that list. So there are about 50 countries which, based on that data set, had longer, more severe restrictions.
Yeah.
But then you get in, as we know, like there are multiple issues there. It like depends on the city, the jurisdiction, and then it also depends on the severity. And even in the difference between Sydney and Melbourne, right? Like you were talking to me about this, like this idea of Gladys Berejiklian saying, well, the Sydney restrictions are more severe than the Melbourne ones.
Yeah.
And we speak the same language, we're
Yeah.
just like a few kilometers away from each other, and even that is a contentious idea. I was interested in this idea. Like I was like, why is Buenos Aires like the most locked down city in the world? Like that is so random, don't you
Yeah.
think? So I called a journalist who was based there. He was so awesome. And his name was Yuki Gonyi, and he was writing for The Guardian. And honestly, like it just comes back to this thing of that the world is complicated. So we all Australian media were presenting that as this very black and white issue. Buenos Aires has been locked down for 240 something days, and Melbourne will surpass that on Sunday. Blah blah blah. When really, you think about the politics in Buenos Aires, in Argentina at large. Incredible politics. Like you've got the Peronistas, and then the right wing sort of parties. There's Buenos Aires proper, the center, then there's Greater Buenos Aires. He was talking about compliance. He was like, compliance is like abysmal sort of thing, right? So even just that comparison, that's when I was like, oh God, I don't think I'm going to be able to post a Twitter thread about this tonight. So I can get it on for about a year. But it's something that I still want to get to the bottom of, because I think it's a really good example of how the world is complicated.
Yes.
Yes.
And also how an idea can get started from one headline and just run like wildfire, and you can't call it back. It's like the Terry Pratchett line that a lie can run around the world before truth can get its boots on. It's like it's gone. Once it's out there, it's gone.
You are exactly right. And everyone said it too. Like some of the people who I respect so much the most, like everyone said it just became a fact. And how do you fact check something like that? Like literally, how do you?
Oh, it's insane. I mean, I wrote a blog post at the time when Gladys Berejiklian said our lockdown is stricter than Melbourne's. I was like, being a Melbourne person and having been very, very locked down. And I went and compared like each step. And yes, some were more strict, quite a lot were less strict. How do you put a number on that? How do you rank that? You can't. It's nonsensical, really. But we want certainty, and we want binaries, and we want to be able to make these sweeping statements. And so when somebody makes them, we just grab them and cling to them, I think. How do you're obviously looking at a lot of the data in that rationally skeptical way and going, hang on a minute, where did that come from? When you see a graph in the media, what's the first thing you think?
Well,
or the first question you ask?
I am in a habit now of checking the credit, who it credits for the graph, especially if it's of COVID, because there were so many scumbags who they just sort of steal something and then they say, I got this from New South Wales Health. And I'm like, oh, really? You've been through every single press release for the last year from New South Wales Health? I doubt it, right? I think I clicked the download button and used the data on my website. But, I mean, in general, the first thing I ask, I guess I do look at them all a different way now. Look, the source is actually something that I look at a lot, and what sort of source that is. And then, look, I do also sort of, I guess I look at it from a sort of critically aesthetic point of view as well. Not colors, but like the question that I think a good graph tells a story, right? And like a picture says 1,000 words. And so that's sort of what I look at it like what's the story that this graph tells, and is it telling it adequately? And so, for instance, sometimes you see like annoying charts that are like stacked bar charts, which I've got a lot of on my website, but it's interactive, so people can remove the bars that they want. But I do kind of think, oh, this person either understands or doesn't understand how to capture an idea, a concept, and convey information in a simple way through the chart. So that's always the thing that I'm looking for.
I love that perspective of visualizations as storytelling, because that's what they are. And I think we, in the way we handle it in education, we tend to forget that. The maths curriculum has, here is a stem and leaf plot. Here is, you use a bar chart for discrete data and a line graph for continuous data, and that's it. It's like, hang on a minute, what are you trying to say? Like any form of communication, I used to teach communication skills to computer science students and always be like, who's your audience? What are you trying to say? What will they understand? And what's the message you're trying to get across? That all applies to visualizations just as much. And we forget, I think, that they are telling a story, and that like any story, they might not be, could be fiction, could be nonfiction.
That's right.
We've got to think
Yeah.
about that.
You're right, actually, and actually, that's the other side of the same coin. So you do need it to tell a story, but then you're checking the sort of basic uh, things to see if the story has been sort of conjured up. For instance, what is the time period? What time frame does it show? Does it start in 2018? What happened before 2018?
Mm.
Does the y-axis start on 0?
Yep.
And so you want it to show a story, but not at the cost of basically the overall truth.
Yeah, that's right. It's got to be compelling, but it also has to be valid.
Exactly, well said.
That's what I what I taught to my year 10s when I first started doing data science, and I think it's one of the fundamentals. Do you think the pandemic has really changed our understanding of data?
Yes, I do. I absolutely do. And my sort of focus at the moment, and I'm working with some other COVID data trackers to do it, is to try to harness the lessons from COVID and to keep them and keep pushing, right? So I think there's been a lot of pushing different governments for better data
Yeah,
in COVID, and I don't want us to, now COVID's over, to go back to our old ways. Like, we're going to push harder, especially in terms of climate. So, I mean, the things that I've taken away from COVID and that I really want to apply to other areas of public interest data are things like timeliness. So, data tracking in as close to real time as possible. This idea of transparency. So, you can see the data history. You need the context. It's not just about snapshots, right?
yeah,
And I think NGOs have a lot to learn about this as well. Like, whatever, 30% of, uh, I don't know, people under 25 have anxiety. That's not an actual quote. That's an example, right?
yeah,
Okay, that's a snapshot, but
yeah.
give us some context, right? Like, where's
How
it
has that
going?
changed?
Like, people want a line that goes up or down,
Yeah,
right? It's
yeah,
not, it's actually not that hard.
yeah.
But that's a pretty basic one that I think we need to move into. I work with this awesome guy. He's anonymous on Twitter, actually. His Twitter handle is dead in long run, which I totally agree with. Citizen science. And he and I have talked about this concept of, and I reckon you'll love this, Linda. You're probably familiar with it, but it's this idea of giving people the information and making it so clear that the logic is, they self discover the logic,
Yeah,
right? Um, so I think in a lot of news coverage and media, we have talking heads and we have, this person says this and this person says this. And then
yeah,
it's like, well, I don't know who to believe. Like, sometimes they're saying the total opposite.
yeah,
But with data and transparent data, we have an opportunity to just say, here is the data, right? And what this is saying, absolutely taking into account the world is complicated, all of these caveats, but you have the same information that we have,
yeah.
right? So you can self discover this logic for yourself. So that's what would love to just push along with other areas of public interest data.
It's an opportunity, isn't it? A
Totally.
chance to make things better. I'll work on education. You can work on the adults.
Deal. Done deal. Oh my god, kids are so much better than adults. Adults are crazy.
Yeah, I can't argue. Thank you so much. This has been the best conversation. I could honestly talk to you all day, but I should probably, wind up at some point and get a manageable size podcast out.
Oh, totally. No, thank you. It's been amazing. I hope we stay in touch.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Thanks so much.
No worries.
Thanks for listening to Make Me Data Literate. You can support the work of the Australian Data Science Education Institute at givenow.com.au/ADSEI. Tune in next time for more conversations with amazing data experts.